The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crimson sky as Ethan Pierce reloaded his Winchester with practiced precision. The year was 1873, and out here in the wilds of Wyoming Territory, a man's reflexes meant the difference between life and death. He just dispatched a rattlesnake that had threatened his horse, a minor inconvenience on his journey back to Granite Creek after 2 weeks of tracking a particularly elusive Mustang herd. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, squinting at the setting sun. At 32, he'd spent more years under the open sky than beneath a proper roof. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who smiled rarely, but meant it when he did. The small homestead he maintained on the outskirts of Granite Creek was more than most solitary men could claim, but he never quite thought of it as home. "Come on, Duster," he murmured to his dun stallion, patting its muscular neck. "Town's still a few miles out. Best make it before dark." The road to Granite Creek wound through rocky terrain before opening onto the high plains. As the outline of the small Wyoming settlement appeared on the horizon, Ethan felt the familiar ambivalence that always accompanied his return to civilization. The town represented necessity supplies, occasional work, human contact, but never quite acceptance. Granite Creek had grown considerably since its founding as a trading post in the 1850s. The discovery of modest silver deposits in the nearby mountains, and the subsequent arrival of the railway spur, had transformed it into a bustling community of nearly 500 souls. Its main street now boasted a general store, 2 saloons, a small hotel, a church, and the usual assortment of businesses that constituted a proper frontier town. The first peculiarity Ethan noticed was the crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. In a town where most folk kept to their own affairs, such a congregation usually meant trouble. His instinct was to ride past other people's problems rarely improved with his involvement, but curiosity won out. He dismounted, looping Duster's reins around the hitching post outside the barber shop. "What's the commotion?" Ethan asked Tom Fletcher, the aging barber who stood in his doorway, arms crossed over his apron. "That Russell woman," Tom replied, his voice lowered despite the general clamor. "The one who arrived on yesterday's train. Sheriff's got her locked up and Mayor Hollister's calling for her immediate removal." Ethan frowned. "Removal? On what grounds?" "Claims she's a con artist. Apparently worked some scheme back East Boston or Philadelphia, I forget which. Someone recognized her from a wanted poster. Nothing proven yet, but folks are riled up." The crowd parted momentarily, revealing the silhouette of a woman visible through the sheriff's office window. Even at this distance, her posture conveyed dignity rather than guilt. Since when does Granite Creek pass judgment before a trial? Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the barber. Tom shrugged. "Since a respectable-looking woman showed up claiming to be a widow with plans to open a dress shop, I suppose. Caught the interest of several of our more eligible bachelors right quick." Some of the town wives didn't take kindly to that. Ethan had seen enough frontier justice to know how quickly suspicion could turn to condemnation, especially for a woman traveling alone. He made his way through the throng, ignoring the disapproving glances his dust-covered appearance attracted from the town's more genteel residents. Sheriff Wade Miller stood on the office steps, attempting to disperse the gathering. A stocky man with a silver-streaked mustache, Miller had kept order in Granite Creek for nearly a decade, usually with a fair hand, which made this situation all the more curious. "Nothing more to see here, folks," the sheriff announced. "The matter will be handled according to the law." "And what law might that be, Wade?" Ethan called out, causing heads to turn. The sheriff's expression tightened upon recognizing him. "Pierce, Didn't know you were back in town. Just arrived. Heard you've got a prisoner. Also heard there might be more accusation than evidence." "This doesn't concern you," Miller replied, his tone hardening. "The woman's fate will be decided by those with authority in this town. Like Mayor Hollister." Ethan glanced toward the portly figure standing nearby, whose flushed face suggested he'd been making impassioned declarations. "The same man who tried to run the Cheyenne families off their legitimate claims last spring." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The mayor stepped forward, straightening his waistcoat over his substantial belly. "Now see here, Pierce," Hollister began, his jowls quivering with indignation. "This woman has been identified as Rebecca Whitfield, wanted in Massachusetts for swindling several prominent families. We're merely protecting our community from a known criminal." "Identified by whom?" Ethan persisted. "And has anyone bothered to hear her account?" "She denies it, of course," the sheriff interjected. "Claims she's never been east of the Mississippi." "Then perhaps a telegram to the authorities in Massachusetts would resolve the matter." Mayor Hollister's expression soured. "That could take weeks. In the meantime, we'd have a potential criminal in our midst." Ethan's patience waned. "In my experience, Mayor, the truly dangerous criminals rarely announce their arrival on the afternoon train, nor do they plan to open businesses under their own names." A few chuckles from the crowd encouraged him to continue. "I'll take responsibility for her," Ethan declared, surprising himself almost as much as everyone else. "You?" Sheriff Miller's eyebrows rose to his hairline. "The man who barely sets foot in town 3 times a month wants to vouch for a complete stranger. My property sits on 200 acres with no neighbors for miles," Ethan reasoned. "If she's of a mind to swindle anyone, she'll find mighty poor pickings at my homestead. She can stay in my cabin while I take the barn until this matter is settled properly." A stunned silence fell over the gathering. Ethan Pierce, the solitary rancher who'd rebuffed every attempt at socialization since arriving in Granite Creek 5 years prior, was offering sanctuary to a woman he'd never even met. "This is highly irregular," the mayor sputtered. "So is condemning someone without proof," Ethan countered. "Sheriff, you know I'm good for it. If she turns out to be guilty, I'll personally deliver her to face justice." Sheriff Miller hesitated, stroking his mustache in contemplation. Despite their occasional differences, he and Ethan had built a cautious respect over the years. Miller had seen enough frontier tribunals go wrong to harbor his own doubts about the hasty proceedings. "I suppose it would provide time for proper investigation," the sheriff conceded finally, "but you'll need to post bond. Name the amount." After brief negotiations and the surrender of most of Ethan's spring cattle sale earnings, Sheriff Miller retrieved a ring of keys and led Ethan into the office. The crowd, disappointed by the anticlimactic resolution, began to disperse, though not without considerable grumbling. The woman sat rigidly on a bench inside the single cell, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a travel-worn but well-made dress of deep blue, her chestnut hair pinned back severely beneath a modest hat. As they entered, she looked up, revealing a face that struck Ethan with its quiet determination rather than conventional beauty. Her eyes, a startling shade of amber, assessed him with undisguised wariness. "Miss Whitfield," Sheriff Miller began. "My name is Rebecca Winters," she interrupted, her voice carrying a slight Western twang rather than an Eastern accent. "As I've repeated numerous times." "Regardless of your name, madam," the sheriff continued, "this gentleman has offered to stand surety for you while we investigate these allegations." Her gaze shifted fully to Ethan, taking in his trail-worn appearance with obvious skepticism. "And who might you be, sir?" "Ethan Pierce. I have a homestead outside town, And why would you intercede for someone you don't know? The directness of her question confirmed Ethan's initial impression of her character. Let's just say I've seen too many people judged hastily in frontier towns, he replied. The alternative is you sitting in this cell until communications with Massachusetts are complete. Could be weeks. Rebecca considered this, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Finally, she rose, smoothing her skirts with dignity. I accept your offer, Mr. Pierce, though I assure you these accusations are entirely mistaken. I am not this Rebecca Whitfield they seek. Sheriff Miller unlocked the cell door. Your belongings are behind my desk. I've kept everything secure. Rebecca retrieved a modest carpet bag and a worn leather satchel. My larger trunk, still at the station, the sheriff confirmed. I'll have it delivered to Pierce's property tomorrow. Outside, the street had mostly cleared, though curious eyes watched from shop windows as Ethan led Rebecca to where Duster waited patiently. I'll need to purchase a few supplies before we leave town, Ethan explained. My pantry wasn't expecting company. I have some funds, Rebecca offered stiffly. I can pay for my own provisions. Your money might be needed elsewhere if this situation drags on, Ethan countered. Consider it part of my surety. The general store's proprietor, Albert Simmons, made little effort to disguise his curiosity as Ethan purchased additional flour, coffee, sugar, and dried goods. Rebecca stood near the door, her posture rigid, pointedly ignoring the whispers of two women examining fabric nearby. Quite the unexpected development, Pierce, Simmons commented as he tallied the purchases. Never figured you for a gallant rescuer. Just doing what's reasonable, Ethan replied curtly. Any chance you could have these delivered to my place tomorrow along with the lady's trunk? Duster's already carrying double. With arrangements made, Ethan secured Rebecca's smaller bags to the saddle and mounted Duster, then extended his hand to help her up behind him. I've never ridden double before, she admitted quietly as she settled awkwardly behind him. Just hold onto my waist and move with the horse, he instructed. It's not a long ride. As they left Granite Creek behind, Ethan became acutely aware of the slender arms tentatively circling his midsection and the unfamiliar sensation of another person's warmth against his back. They rode in silence for some time, the rhythmic sound of Duster's hooves on the hard, packed earth the only conversation. You know nothing about me, Rebecca finally said, her voice barely audible above the wind. Why risk your money and reputation? Ethan considered the question. I've learned to recognize when something doesn't add up. This accusation against you feels wrong. So you acted on instinct, partly, he acknowledged. Also figured if you were actually running from something, you'd have chosen a more remote location than Granite Creek. Not much escapes notice there. Her soft laugh surprised him. A logical assessment, though I'm beginning to think a more remote location might have been wiser. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the landscape in deepening shades of gold and purple. Ethan's homestead appeared on the horizon, a sturdy log cabin with a covered porch, a well-maintained barn, and several fenced pastures where a small herd of cattle grazed. A vegetable garden occupied a patch beside the house, and several fruit trees, still young but beginning to bear, stood nearby. It was modest compared to many ranches, but represented years of solitary labor. It's lovely, Rebecca remarked unexpectedly as they approached. More established than I would have guessed. Been here 5 years, Ethan replied, feeling oddly pleased by her approval. Built everything myself, except for the help I hired for the barn raising. He brought Duster to a stop before the cabin and dismounted, then reached up to assist Rebecca. Her hands gripped his shoulders as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood closer than necessary, an awkward awareness passing between them before Ethan stepped back. "I'll see to Duster, then show you the cabin," he said, busying himself with unloading their packages. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat for a bachelor's dwelling, a single room with a stone fireplace, a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, a cast iron cookstove, open shelves holding provisions and cooking implements, and a curtained-off area that presumably contained a bed. A braided rug covered part of the plank floor, and kerosene lamps hung from hooks on the walls. "It's not much," Ethan apologized as he lit one of the lamps, "but it's sturdy enough." Rebecca set her bags near the door. "It's more than adequate, Mr. Pierce. I've stayed in far less comfortable places." "Ethan," he corrected, "if we're to share quarters, even temporarily, Mr. Pierce seems overly formal." She hesitated, then nodded. "Ethan, then. And I am Rebecca, not Miss Whitfield or whatever other names they've attached to me." He gestured toward the curtained alcove. "The bed is yours. I'll take the barn loft until we get this sorted." "I couldn't possibly displace you from your own home," she protested. "I've slept under the stars more nights than under a roof," he assured her. "The barn's luxury by comparison." Recognizing his resolve, Rebecca relented. "Thank you. Your kindness is unexpected." Ethan busied himself lighting the cookstove. "Are you hungry? I can put together a simple meal." "Please allow me," she countered. "It's the least I can do, and I'm actually quite capable in a kitchen." To his surprise, Ethan found himself relinquishing control of his domain, watching as Rebecca efficiently assessed his supplies and began preparing a meal from the ingredients at hand. She moved with confidence, humming softly as she worked a domestic scene so foreign to his solitary existence that it created an odd tightness in his chest. Over a dinner of pan-fried salt pork, potatoes, and the last of his preserved green beans, Ethan finally voiced the question that had been troubling him. "If you're not Rebecca Whitfield, how did this accusation come about?" Rebecca set down her fork with deliberation. "A case of unfortunate coincidence, I believe. I arrived on the train, inquired about renting space for a dress shop, and introduced myself. By evening, I was being called a criminal. Someone must have made a specific accusation." She nodded, her expression darkening. "Mrs. Hargrove, the banker's wife, claimed she recognized me from a description in a Boston newspaper she receives. Once she raised the alarm, others were quick to recall having seen similar notices. And you've never been to Boston, never east of the Mississippi, as I told the sheriff. I was born in Missouri and have lived in Kansas, Colorado, and briefly in California before coming to Wyoming." Ethan studied her face, looking for signs of deception but finding none. "What brought you to Granite Creek specifically?" A shadow crossed her features. "I saw an advertisement in a Denver newspaper, a town seeking new businesses, particularly those catering to ladies' needs. After my situation in Denver became untenable, it seemed a good opportunity." "Untenable?" Ethan prompted when she didn't elaborate. Rebecca's hands twisted in her lap. "I was engaged to be married. The arrangement ended poorly." The finality in her tone suggested this was all the explanation she intended to offer. Ethan respected her reticence. Everyone carried secrets in the West, himself included. "Well," he said finally, rising to clear their plates, "Granite Creek could certainly use a dress shop. The ladies currently travel to Cheyenne for any garment more complicated than a basic work dress." "If I'm allowed to stay," she reminded him, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Even if these accusations are disproven, the damage to my reputation may already be done." "Frontier memories can be short when it's convenient," Ethan observed, "especially if you prove yourself useful." Later, after settling Rebecca in the cabin with assurances about the door's sturdy lock, Ethan made his way to the barn loft. Stretched out on a makeshift bed of clean hay covered with blankets, he stared at the roof beams, listening to the familiar sounds of night on the prairie. His actions today defied explanation, even to himself. In 5 years, he'd barely exchanged more than necessary words with most of Granite Creek's residents, preferring solitude to the complications of community. Yet something about the dignity with which Rebecca faced her accusers had stirred a protective instinct he'd thought long buried. Perhaps it was recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else, who carried wounds invisible to others, but defining nonetheless. Or perhaps, after years of self-imposed isolation, even Ethan Pierce was susceptible to human connection. Whatever the reason, he'd committed himself to her cause now. As he drifted toward sleep, Ethan found himself hoping that Rebecca Winters was exactly who she claimed to be, for reasons that had nothing to do with the money he'd posted for her bond. Dawn broke with the persistent crowing of Ethan's rooster, a sound Rebecca hadn't heard since leaving her childhood home in Missouri years ago. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself in the unfamiliar surroundings, before rising to dress quickly in yesterday's travel clothes. Her trunk, with its modest selection of garments, wouldn't arrive until later today. The cabin was empty when she emerged from behind the curtain, but the cookstove remained warm. A note propped against a coffee pot informed her that Ethan had gone to check on the cattle and would return mid-morning. The simple consideration leaving coffee prepared for her touched Rebecca unexpectedly. After a light breakfast of leftover bread found in a tin on the shelf, she decided to make herself useful. The cabin, while tidy, showed signs of a bachelor's minimal approach to housekeeping. Rebecca filled a bucket from the pump outside and set about giving the place a thorough cleaning, finding satisfaction in the rhythmic, familiar work. By the time Ethan returned, the plank floor gleamed from scrubbing, the windows sparkled, and a batch of fresh biscuits cooled on the table. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand, clearly surprised by the transformation. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, though his appreciation was evident in his expression. "Idle hands aren't my preference," Rebecca replied. "Besides, it's a small repayment for your hospitality." Ethan washed at the basin she'd prepared, then accepted the cup of coffee she offered. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said as he settled at the table. "Seems to me the quickest resolution would be contacting the authorities in Boston directly, rather than waiting for Sheriff Miller to do so." "I suggested as much yesterday," Rebecca noted, "but the sheriff seemed reluctant to spend town funds on telegrams for my benefit." "Then we'll send one ourselves. I need to ride back to town anyway, left some business unfinished yesterday with all the commotion." Rebecca hesitated. "I'm not certain returning to town is wise for me just yet." The reception was less than welcoming. "You can stay here if you prefer," Ethan assured her. "But showing fear will only encourage those inclined to believe the worst. Better to face them directly." His logic resonated with her, though the prospect of confronting Granite Creek's suspicious citizens again so soon made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Still, Rebecca had never been one to hide from challenges. "Very well," she conceded, "though I should change into something more suitable." She glanced down at her rumpled traveling dress. "If my trunk has arrived, we'll check at the station first thing," Ethan promised. "I have some business at the bank that shouldn't take long." They rode into town an hour later, this time with Rebecca perched somewhat awkwardly on an old saddle Ethan had adjusted for Copper, his more docile mare. The journey provided opportunity for Rebecca to appreciate the dramatic landscape surrounding Granite Creek, rolling grasslands rising gradually to meet pine-covered foothills, with the majestic peaks of the mountains visible as purple shadows against the western horizon. "It's beautiful country," she remarked, breaking a comfortable silence. "Different from the Kansas plains where I grew up." Ethan nodded. "That's what drew me here. Traveled all over after the war: Texas, New Mexico Territory, Colorado. Nothing felt right until I saw this valley." "You fought in the war?" Rebecca asked, surprised by this voluntary sharing of personal information. "Union cavalry," he confirmed shortly. "Not something I care to revisit." His tone discouraged further questions, and Rebecca respected the boundary. She understood all too well the desire to leave certain chapters of one's past undiscussed. Granite Creek appeared much as it had the previous day, though with significantly less fanfare attending their arrival. A few townspeople paused in their morning activities to watch as Ethan and Rebecca rode down Main Street, but most quickly returned to their business. At the railway station, they found Rebecca's trunk had indeed arrived, but remained unclaimed. The station master, a ratty man with spectacles perched on his nose, regarded Rebecca with undisguised curiosity as Ethan arranged for the trunk's delivery to his homestead. "Heard about your situation, madam," the station master ventured. "Quite the commotion yesterday." "A misunderstanding that will soon be clarified," Rebecca replied with more confidence than she felt. "Well, I'm sure it will all sort itself out," he said, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Pierce here is a good judge of character for a man who keeps to himself." This backhanded endorsement seemed to amuse Ethan, who merely tipped his hat as they departed. "Telegraph office next," he decided. "Then the bank while you find something in your trunk suitable for a proper introduction to Granite Creek." The telegraph operator, Mr. Finch, was considerably more discreet than the station master, accepting Ethan's carefully worded inquiry to the Boston Police Department with professional detachment. He promised to relay any response immediately upon receipt. "Could be days," he warned. "Lines east of Cheyenne have been troublesome lately." "We'll check back regularly," Ethan assured him, counting out coins for both the outgoing message and future replies. After confirming that Rebecca's trunk had been loaded onto the delivery wagon, Ethan escorted her to the hotel. "I need to see about a bank draft," he explained. "The hotel dining room serves a decent lunch. Meet me there in an hour," Rebecca agreed, grateful for the opportunity to refresh herself properly. The hotel proprietor, Mrs. Landry, a plump, pleasant woman in her 50s, showed none of the previous day's suspicion as she led Rebecca to a small but clean washroom where the trunk awaited. "Pay no mind to yesterday's nonsense," Mrs. Landry advised conspiratorially. "Half the gossips in this town have checkered pasts themselves. Why, Mayor Hollister's wife ran a saloon girl establishment in Denver before she found religion and married into respectability." This unexpected alliance bolstered Rebecca's spirits as she changed into her second-best dress, a sage green cotton with modest ivory trim. After arranging her hair more carefully and dabbing lavender water at her wrists, she felt armored for the public scrutiny that awaited. The hotel dining room was half filled with the early lunch crowd when Rebecca descended. She felt eyes tracking her progress, but kept her posture straight and her expression composed as she requested a table. By the time Ethan arrived, looking somewhat out of place in his trail clothes amidst the merchants and townspeople in their more formal attire, Rebecca had weathered several curious glances without incident. "You look—" Ethan paused, seemingly searching for an appropriate word. "More yourself." Rebecca smiled at the awkward compliment. Amazing what clean clothing can accomplish after days of travel. Their meal progressed pleasantly enough, with Ethan sharing observations about the surrounding countryside, and Rebecca cautiously revealing her plans for a dress shop specializing in practical frontier fashions, but incorporating Eastern styles where appropriate. "There's a vacant storefront 2 doors down from the general store," she noted. "With living quarters above, it would be perfect, assuming I'm permitted to remain in Granite Creek." "You will be," Ethan assured her with unexpected conviction. Their comfortable exchange was interrupted by the approach of Sheriff Miller, accompanied by a woman Rebecca recognized as Mrs. Hargrove, the banker's wife who had first raised accusations against her. "Miss Winters," the sheriff greeted her with stiff formality. "Mrs. Hargrove has something she wishes to say to you." The elegantly dressed woman, whose pinched expression suggested the task was deeply unpleasant, clasped her gloved hands tightly before her. "It seems I may have been hasty in my identification," she admitted, each word apparently extracted at great cost to her pride. "My husband has examined the description in the newspaper more carefully and notes several discrepancies." "Such as?" Ethan prompted when she failed to elaborate. Mrs. Hargrove's lips thinned further. "The Rebecca Whitfield mentioned is described as having auburn hair and green eyes. Additionally, she would be approximately 40 years of age. Rebecca, at 28 and with decidedly brown hair and amber eyes, raised an eyebrow but remained silent." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I've sent telegrams to Boston myself this morning, but in light of this information, the mayor has agreed to suspend any action against Miss Winters pending official confirmation." "How magnanimous," Ethan commented dryly. "Particularly since there was never any evidence beyond mistaken hearsay." "We were merely exercising appropriate caution," Mrs. Hargrove sniffed. "One cannot be too careful about the character of those settling in our community." "Indeed," Rebecca finally spoke, her tone deliberately mild. "I completely understand the importance of careful judgment based on accurate information. It's a principle I value highly myself." The subtle rebuke was not lost on Mrs. Hargrove, whose cheeks flushed slightly before she excused herself with minimal civility. Sheriff Miller lingered a moment longer. "For what it's worth, Miss Winters, I apologize for your discomfort. Once the confirmation arrives from Boston, you'll be completely cleared, of course." After the sheriff departed, Ethan's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "That was well handled." "I've learned that maintaining dignity often serves better than justified outrage," Rebecca replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "Still, it's unsettling to realize how quickly one's reputation can be damaged by careless words." "Frontier towns thrive on gossip," Ethan observed. "Not much entertainment otherwise." "Speaking of entertainment," Rebecca said, eager to change the subject, "I noticed posters for a town social this Saturday. Apparently, there's to be music and dancing at the newly completed schoolhouse." Ethan's expression closed immediately. "I don't attend town functions." "Never?" Rebecca asked, surprised by his vehemence. "Not in 5 years," he confirmed. "Found it simpler to maintain distance." Rebecca studied him curiously but didn't press the issue. There was clearly more to Ethan Pierce's solitary existence than mere preference for isolation, but such confidences couldn't be rushed. She'd carried her own secrets long enough to respect others' privacy. Their return to the homestead that afternoon was accompanied by the wagon delivering Rebecca's trunk and their supplies. The driver, a teenage boy who introduced himself as Jimmy Fletcher, the barber's son, unloaded everything with eager efficiency, clearly burning with curiosity about the arrangement but too well-mannered to ask direct questions. As the days passed, Rebecca and Ethan established an unexpectedly harmonious routine. Mornings found him tending to ranch chores while she maintained the cabin and prepared meals. Afternoons often saw them working side by side, Ethan repairing fences or tending the vegetable garden, Rebecca assisting where she could or working on small sewing projects using materials from her trunk. Their evenings were spent in surprisingly comfortable companionship. With Rebecca reading aloud from one of the few books, Ethan possessed mostly practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, but also a worn copy of Dickens's Great Expectations that had evidently been read many times. Ethan, for his part, proved an attentive listener, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that revealed an intelligence belied by his taciturn manner. On their third morning, as Rebecca needed dough for bread, she ventured a question that had been forming since their arrival. How does a man who clearly appreciates literature end up alone on a Wyoming ranch? Ethan, who had been cleaning his rifle at the table, paused momentarily. Same way anyone ends up anywhere, I suppose. Series of choices, some better than others. That's hardly an answer, Rebecca chided gently. He set down his cleaning cloth with deliberation. My father was a schoolteacher in Ohio, believed education was the path to a better world. I grew up surrounded by books, expected to follow his path. But you didn't. The war intervened, Ethan said simply. Afterward, classrooms felt confining. Rebecca nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. The war changed many trajectories. What about you? Ethan countered, clearly preferring to redirect the conversation. How does a dressmaker from Missouri find herself accused of crimes in Boston? Rebecca's hands stilled in the dough. As you said, a series of choices, some better than others. That's hardly an answer, he echoed, the hint of a smile softening his features. She sighed, recognizing the fairness of his challenge. My father was a farmer who lost everything in the Panic of '57. He died when I was 16, leaving my mother and me destitute. I learned dressmaking from necessity, not vocation. And your mother passed 4 years later. Consumption. Rebecca resumed kneading, finding comfort in the rhythmic motion. I've been making my own way since. Kansas City, Denver, briefly San Francisco, then back to Denver. Where your engagement ended poorly, Ethan recalled. Rebecca's expression tightened. Yes. Sensing her reluctance, Ethan returned to his rifle, allowing the subject to drop. This pattern characterized many of their conversations, moments of revelation, followed by mutual respect for unspoken boundaries. Neither pushed too far, both recognizing the value of earned trust rather than extracted confidences. On the fourth day, they rode into town to check for telegraph responses, finding none yet available but noticing a subtle shift in the town's reception. Mrs. Landry at the hotel greeted Rebecca warmly, introducing her to several other merchants who expressed interest in her dress shop plans. Even Mayor Hollister, encountered outside the bank, managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement. Your stock is rising, Ethan observed as they left the general store, where Mr. Simmons had been almost effusive in his welcome. Won't be long before they're claiming they supported you all along. People generally prefer being on the winning side of any situation, Rebecca agreed. Though I'm not counting my victory until official word arrives from Boston. That evening, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching twilight settle over the prairie, Ethan surprised Rebecca by reviving their earlier conversation. About your engagement, he began awkwardly. I didn't mean to pry. Rebecca watched a hawk circling lazily in the distance. You weren't prying. It's a natural question. Still, your business is your own. She appreciated his sensitivity, but found herself suddenly willing to share what she'd held close. His name was Charles Reeves. A banker's son in Denver with political aspirations. We met when I was commissioned to create gowns for his sister's coming-out party. Ethan remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. He was charming, well-read, seemingly everything I could want in a husband. The connection to his family would have provided security I hadn't known since childhood. Rebecca's fingers twisted in her skirt. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he was already married to a woman in St. Louis he'd abandoned 2 years prior. Ethan's expression darkened. The coward. It gets worse, Rebecca admitted with a bitter smile. When confronted, he claimed he'd intended to obtain a divorce, but regardless, our marriage would need to remain secret for the sake of his political future. His family could arrange papers that would appear legitimate enough. And he expected you to agree to this. He seemed genuinely surprised when I refused. Rebecca shook her head at the memory. What followed was unpleasant. He spread rumors suggesting I'd been the one attempting to trap him into an inappropriate relationship. His family's influence ensured many believed him. My business suffered immediately, so you left. I had little choice. My reputation, both personal and professional, was in tatters. She sighed deeply. I thought Granite Creek, being smaller and farther removed, might offer a fresh start. Ironic that I immediately faced accusations of being someone else entirely. Ethan's hand moved as if to reach for hers, then withdrew. For what it's worth, I believe your fresh start is still possible here. His quiet conviction warmed something long cold within Rebecca's chest. Thank you. Not just for the sentiment, but for everything these past days. Twilight deepened around them, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Neither seemed inclined to move indoors, the peaceful moments stretching comfortably between them. I had a wife once, Ethan said suddenly, his voice so low Rebecca almost missed the words. During the war, Sarah, we married on furlough, had exactly 17 days together before my regiment was called to Vicksburg. Rebecca held her breath, sensing the rarity of this confidence. She wrote faithfully, every week for 2 years, no matter where we were stationed. His eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon, until the letters stopped coming. Thought maybe they weren't reaching her or hers weren't reaching me, wartime mail being what it was. What happened? Rebecca asked gently when he paused. Influenza swept through our hometown in early '65. Took Sarah and her entire family. His voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. I didn't learn of it until after Appomattox. Came home to find nothing left but graves. I'm so sorry, Rebecca whispered, the words woefully inadequate for such loss. Ethan nodded once, accepting her sympathy. After that, staying in Ohio made no sense. Drifted west, worked cattle drives, tried prospecting briefly. Nothing stuck until this place. And you've been alone since. Seemed simpler that way. He finally turned to meet her gaze. Until recently. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge its significance. Rebecca felt a peculiar lightness in her chest, equal parts trepidation and possibility. The moment was broken by the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. Ethan rose, instantly alert, his hand moving toward the rifle that was never far from reach, expecting anyone. Rebecca asked, suddenly anxious. No, Ethan replied, his posture tense as he scanned the darkening landscape. The rider appeared along the main trail, moving at a steady pace rather than the urgent gallop that might signal trouble. As the figure drew closer, Ethan relaxed slightly. It's Jimmy Fletcher, he identified the young man who had delivered their supplies earlier that week. The teenager reined in before the porch, touching his hat respectfully. Evening, Mr. Pierce. Miss Winters. Sheriff Miller sent me. Telegraph came in from Boston this afternoon. Rebecca stood, her heart suddenly racing. "And? Good news, madam," Jimmy grinned. "The real Rebecca Whitfield was arrested in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, been in custody the whole time. Sheriff says you're completely cleared." The relief that washed over Rebecca was so intense she had to grip the porch railing for support. "Thank you for bringing word so promptly." "No trouble at all," Jimmy assured her, clearly pleased to be the bearer of good tidings. "Sheriff said to tell you the town council's meeting tomorrow morning and would welcome you to attend something about discussing your business license." After Jimmy departed with a fresh canteen of water and Rebecca's thanks, she turned to find Ethan watching her with an unreadable expression. "It's over," she said, still processing the reality of her vindication. "As it should be," he replied. "You'll be able to open your shop now." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, though the victory felt suddenly complicated. "I should return to town tomorrow, find proper accommodations while I arrange the store rental." Ethan's face remained carefully neutral. "No need to rush. The offer of my cabin stands until you're properly settled." "That's very kind, but I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Rebecca hesitated, then added, "Besides, people will talk if I remain here now that necessity no longer requires it." "Let them talk," Ethan said with unexpected vehemence. "You've done nothing improper." We both know perception often matters more than reality, especially for a woman establishing a business. Rebecca's practical nature reasserted itself, despite the surprising disappointment she felt at the prospect of leaving the homestead. "My reputation has just been restored. I can't afford to compromise it again so soon." Ethan couldn't argue with her logic, though his expression suggested he wanted to. Instead, he nodded curtly. "I'll take you to town after the council meeting then." "Thank you," Rebecca replied softly, wondering why victory suddenly felt like loss. The town council meeting the following morning was a stark contrast to Rebecca's previous reception in Granite Creek. Mayor Hollister himself escorted her to a seat of honor, apologizing profusely for the unfortunate misunderstanding while assuring her of the town's wholehearted support for her business venture. "A ladies' dress shop is exactly what Granite Creek needs," he declared expansively. "Demonstrates our growing sophistication as a community." The vacant storefront Rebecca had admired was quickly approved for her use at a surprisingly reasonable rent. Several prominent townswomen, including Mrs. Hargrove, whose remarkable change of heart seemed directly proportional to her husband's enthusiasm for new business development, offered advance commissions for dresses once Rebecca established her shop. Through it all, Ethan stood silently at the back of the room, his expression inscrutable as he watched Rebecca graciously accept the town's belated welcome. Only she noticed how his jaw tightened when Mayor Hollister patted her hand with avuncular familiarity, or how his eyes narrowed at Mrs. Hargrove's effusive apologies. After the meeting, Rebecca found herself surrounded by well-wishers, making it impossible to speak privately with Ethan. By the time she extricated herself, he had disappeared from the town hall altogether. She found him waiting beside their horses, his expression distant as he adjusted Copper's saddle. "That went well," Rebecca ventured, uncertain why tension seemed to radiate from him. "Remarkably well," Ethan agreed, his tone neutral. "You've been embraced by Granite Creek society with impressive speed." "Hardly society," Rebecca demurred. "Just people who recognize a useful addition to their community." Mayor Hollister certainly seemed impressed. Something in Ethan's voice suggested this wasn't entirely a compliment. Rebecca studied him curiously. "He's interested in the tax revenue a successful business will generate, nothing more, if you say so." Ethan helped her mount Copper with efficient courtesy, no longer meeting her eyes. Mrs. Landry mentioned she has a room ready for you. I'll deliver the remainder of your belongings there." They rode toward the hotel in uncomfortable silence. The easy companionship of previous days mysteriously evaporated. Rebecca searched for words to bridge the sudden distance, but found none that didn't risk revealing emotions she herself barely understood. At the hotel, Ethan unloaded her trunk with mechanical efficiency, declining Mrs. Landry's offer of refreshment with a curt shake of his head. "I should return to the ranch," he said, finally looking directly at Rebecca. "Cattle need tending." "Of course," she replied, wishing desperately for the return of the man who had shared twilight confidences on the porch just yesterday. "Thank you again for everything, Ethan. I don't know how I can repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," he assured her stiffly. "I'm glad things worked out as they should." With that inadequate farewell, he mounted Duster and rode away, leaving Rebecca with the unsettling sensation that something valuable had slipped through her fingers before she'd fully recognized its worth. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Rebecca established her dress shop. The storefront required minimal renovation, fresh paint, better lighting, and display areas for fabric samples and pattern books. The living quarters above proved comfortable enough, with 2 small rooms and a kitchen area that suited her modest needs. Business developed quickly, with orders for everyday dresses supplemented by special commissions for the upcoming Harvest Festival. Rebecca found herself working from dawn until well past dusk, grateful for the demanding schedule that left little time for dwelling on a certain rancher who had not returned to town since delivering her to the hotel. Occasionally, townspeople mentioned Ethan in passing, Mr. Simmons commenting that Pierce had ordered more supplies than usual, Sheriff Miller noting that he'd seen him mending fences along the north boundary of his property. Each casual reference caused a tightness in Rebecca's chest that she refused to examine too closely. "You should come to the Harvest Social," Mrs. Landry urged one afternoon, having stopped by the shop to be fitted for a new Sunday dress. "The whole town attends. Music, dancing, enough food to feed an army." "I'll consider it," Rebecca replied noncommittally, pins held between her lips as she adjusted the dress's hemline. "That handsome rancher of yours might attend," Mrs. Landry added with studied casualness. "The one who stood up for you." Rebecca nearly pricked herself with a pin. "Mr. Pierce is hardly my rancher, and he specifically mentioned that he doesn't attend town functions." The older woman mused. "Shame that. Man shouldn't spend so much time alone. Not healthy." Rebecca changed the subject decisively, but Mrs. Landry's words lingered. The thought of Ethan alone on his homestead, retreating further into isolation, troubled her more than she cared to admit. Yet she had her own life to rebuild, her independence to maintain after the Denver debacle. Becoming entangled in another relationship, particularly with someone as complex and withdrawn as Ethan Pierce, seemed unwise at best. Still, when the day of the Harvest Social arrived, Rebecca found herself putting special care into her appearance. She wore a dress of deep copper silk, one of her finest creations, made during quieter days at the ranch while Ethan repaired fencing nearby. Her hair she arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual practical knot, with soft tendrils framing her face. The schoolhouse had been transformed for the occasion, with autumn leaves and wheat sheaves decorating the walls and tables laden with every imaginable dish contributed by the townspeople. A small group of musicians played lively tunes on fiddles and a slightly out-of-tune piano, while couples of all ages swirled across the cleared floor. Rebecca's entrance caused a small stir, with several people complimenting her dress and welcoming her warmly. She circulated politely, accepting a cup of punch from Mr. Simmons, and admiring Mrs. Fletcher's prize-winning apple pie, all while her eyes involuntarily scanned the room for a tall figure that remained conspicuously absent. "He won't come," Sheriff Miller said quietly, appearing at her elbow with unexpected perception. "Hasn't attended a town gathering since he settled here." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at being so transparent. "I wasn't looking for anyone in particular." The sheriff's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Of course not. Just thought you should know Pierce's absence isn't personal. Man's carried heavy burdens since the war." "He mentioned losing his wife," Rebecca acknowledged carefully. Miller nodded. "Sarah, fine woman by all accounts. But there was more to it than just her passing, though it's not my story to tell." Before Rebecca could question him further, Mayor Hollister approached, claiming her attention with his usual pompous enthusiasm and insisting she join the dancing. For the next hour, she was passed from partner to partner, maintaining a pleasant expression while her thoughts remained fixed on the solitary homestead beyond town. As the evening wore on, Rebecca found herself increasingly restless. The music, the laughter, the easy camaraderie of a community celebrating together all things she had longed for during her difficult days in Denver now felt hollow somehow. Something essential was missing, and she could no longer pretend not to know what or who it was. With sudden clarity, Rebecca realized she had been running from the wrong things, pursuing safety and respectability at the expense of genuine connection. The successful dress shop, the town's acceptance, these were poor substitutes for the quiet understanding she had shared with Ethan during those few precious days. Making her excuses to Mrs. Landry, Rebecca slipped out of the schoolhouse into the cool autumn night. The streets of Granite Creek lay silent under a canopy of stars, businesses closed for the celebration. On impulse, she turned toward her shop, a plan forming that defied all the practical caution she had cultivated since Charles's betrayal. Inside the shop, Rebecca quickly gathered what she needed: her warmest shawl, the practical riding skirt she had made but rarely used in town, a small bag of essentials. The journey to Ethan's homestead was not short, especially after dark, but the full moon provided ample light for the familiar road. The livery stable was closed for the social, but Rebecca knew Mr. Peterson, the elderly stableman, kept a room at the back. After some persistent knocking, he appeared, bewildered by her request to rent a horse at this hour. "It's urgent, Mr. Peterson," she insisted, offering extra payment that eventually overcame his reluctance. "Take Maple," he advised as he saddled a steady chestnut mare. "She knows the way to Pierce's place better than most. Carried the mail out there regular last winter when Jimmy had that broken arm." Rebecca's surprise must have shown on her face, for Peterson chuckled knowingly. "Not many reasons a lady in party clothes would need a horse this time of night, Miss Winters. Especially one who's asking mighty specific questions about whether the mount knows a certain route." Embarrassment warmed her cheeks, but Rebecca lifted her chin defiantly. "My reasons are my own, Mr. Peterson, as they should be," he agreed amiably. "Just be careful out there, and if Pierce gives you any trouble, remind him he still owes me for shoeing Duster last spring." The ride through the moonlit prairie proved less daunting than Rebecca had feared. Maple indeed seemed to know the route, maintaining a steady pace without requiring much guidance. The night air carried the crisp scent of autumn, and the vast silence, broken only by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a night bird, offered welcome space for reflection. What exactly did she intend by this impulsive journey? Rebecca had always prided herself on careful planning, on weighing consequences before acting. Yet here she was, riding alone through the Wyoming night toward a man who might well reject her overture, who had, after all, made no explicit declaration of his feelings. There had been moments, certainly meaningful glances, confidences shared, a tenderness in his manner that suggested deeper emotions than mere duty towards someone under his protection. But Ethan Pierce was a complex man, shaped by loss and clearly accustomed to guarding his heart. What right had she to challenge the boundaries he had established? As these doubts threatened to overwhelm her determination, the outline of Ethan's homestead appeared on the horizon. A single light glowed in the cabin window, suggesting he remained awake despite the late hour. Rebecca slowed Maple to a walk, suddenly uncertain of her welcome. Before she could reconsider, the cabin door opened, spilling golden lamplight across the yard. Ethan's silhouette appeared, rifle in hand, as he surveyed the approach of an unexpected visitor. "Who's there?" he called, his voice carrying clearly in the still night. "It's Rebecca," she replied, drawing Maple to a halt and dismounting somewhat awkwardly, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Ethan lowered the rifle immediately, stepping forward with obvious confusion. "Rebecca, is something wrong in town?" "No," she assured him, leading Maple toward the hitching post. "Everything in town is fine. There's a harvest social tonight, the whole community celebrating together." His brow furrowed as he took the reins from her hands, securing the horse with automatic efficiency. "Then why are you here instead of there?" The directness of his question momentarily robbed Rebecca of her carefully prepared speech. Standing before him in the moonlight, she found herself suddenly, uncharacteristically wordless. "I miss this place," she finally admitted softly. "I missed you." Ethan went very still, his expression hidden in shadow. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Rebecca countered. "I know you stood for me when an entire town stood against me. I know you offered sanctuary without demanding anything in return. I know you read Dickens and can name every constellation in the autumn sky." She took a step closer, courage rising with each word. "I know you lost a great love and chose solitude rather than risk such pain again. And I know, because I've done the same, how empty that choice ultimately proves." "Rebecca," Ethan's voice held a warning, though whether to her or himself remained unclear. "You have a business in town now, a position, a future." "A future of what?" she challenged. "Respectability without connection, security without joy." "I tried that path once with Charles, believing an advantageous marriage would provide everything I lacked. I was wrong then, and I'd be wrong to pursue that hollow version of success now." Moonlight silvered the planes of Ethan's face as he struggled visibly with emotions long suppressed. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I don't know," Rebecca confessed with a small laugh. "That's perhaps the most terrifying part. For the first time in my life, I haven't calculated every potential outcome. I just know that the thought of never seeing you again, of both of us continuing alone when we could be otherwise, seems unbearable." Ethan remained silent so long that Rebecca began to fear she had catastrophically misread the situation. Just as she was preparing to retreat with what dignity she could salvage, he spoke. "When Sarah died, I believed that chapter of my life was permanently closed," he said quietly. "I never expected, never allowed myself to imagine that I might find someone who could." He trailed off, seemingly unable to complete the thought. "Someone who could understand," Rebecca suggested gently. "Someone who has also lost and learned to guard themselves against further hurt." "Yes." The single word carried volumes of acknowledgement. Rebecca gathered her courage for one final truth. "I came tonight because I realized something at the social, watching everyone celebrate together. Safety isn't found in isolation, Ethan. It isn't found in perfect plans or carefully maintained independence. True safety comes from finding someone who knows your wounds and cherishes you anyway. She extended her hand, palm up in the space between them, an invitation rather than a demand. I'm not asking for promises. I'm suggesting possibility. For one endless moment, Ethan stood motionless, his struggle evident in the tension of his shoulders and the careful neutrality of his expression. Then, with deliberation that suggested mountains moving, he reached out and took her offered hand. "I'm not an easy man," he warned, his fingers warm against hers. "Set in my ways after years alone." Rebecca smiled, relief and joy spreading through her like sunrise. "I'm not exactly biddable myself. Just ask Mrs. Hargrove." The sound of Ethan's laughter, genuine and unrestrained, filled the night air, perhaps the first such sound these acres had heard in years. He drew her gently toward him, hesitating a breath away as if offering one final chance to reconsider. Rebecca eliminated that last uncertainty herself, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. The kiss began tentatively, an exploration rather than a conquest, but quickly deepened as long-denied emotions found expression at last. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "You realize this will set Granite Creek gossips ablaze," he murmured. "The dressmaker and the reclusive rancher." "Let them talk," Rebecca replied, echoing his own words from days before. "We've done nothing wrong." "Not yet," Ethan agreed, his voice taking on a hint of playfulness she'd never heard before. "Though Mrs. Landry would certainly have opinions about you being here unchaperoned at this hour." Rebecca laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Then perhaps we should give her something worth gossiping about." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Rebecca, alternating between the practical demands of establishing her business in town and the profound joy of evenings spent with Ethan. They established a new routine. She worked at the shop during daylight hours while he tended his ranch. Then he would arrive at dusk to escort her on horseback to the homestead for dinner and increasingly precious nights together. Granite Creek society indeed buzzed with speculation, but Rebecca found herself caring far less than she would have expected. The few pointed comments directed her way primarily from Mrs. Hargrove, and her circle were met with such serene confidence that they gradually subsided. Sheriff Miller, encountering them together at the general store one afternoon, merely nodded approvingly. "About time Pierce had someone worth coming to town for," he commented, ignoring Ethan's embarrassment with cheerful disregard. As autumn deepened toward winter, practical considerations arose. The daily journey between town and homestead would become increasingly difficult with snowfall, forcing decisions neither had anticipated making so soon. "You could stay in town through the winter," Rebecca suggested one evening as they sat before the cabin's fireplace, her head resting against his shoulder. "The room above the shop is small but adequate for two." Ethan's arm tightened around her. "Or you could close the shop until spring and stay here." Both options presented complications: his discomfort with town life, her reluctance to abandon the business she'd worked so hard to establish. The impasse might have created tension between them had not an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Mr. Simmons, the general store proprietor, approached Rebecca one crisp November morning with a business proposition. His wife's cousin in Cheyenne had expressed interest in managing a dress shop. There would Rebecca consider opening a second location, with the cousin running daily operations while Rebecca provided designs and occasional supervision from Granite Creek. "You'd need to travel to Cheyenne monthly," he explained, "but otherwise could maintain more flexible hours here. The railway makes the journey manageable, even in winter." This arrangement, while requiring initial investment, offered a solution to their dilemma. Rebecca could maintain reduced hours at the Granite Creek shop, focusing on design work that could be done anywhere, including at the homestead during harsh weather. Ethan, for his part, made his own adjustments, hiring Jimmy Fletcher part-time to help with ranch chores, freeing him to spend more days in town when necessary. The cabin underwent renovation, with a proper sewing room added to accommodate Rebecca's work when she wasn't at the shop. Their unconventional situation gradually became accepted, if not entirely conventional, in Granite Creek's estimation. By the time the first heavy snow blanketed the region, most townspeople had adapted to seeing the once reclusive rancher regularly in their midst, just as they'd grown accustomed to their dressmaker occasionally disappearing to the homestead for days at a time. Christmas approached with festive anticipation, the town decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons despite the biting cold. Rebecca found herself busier than ever, creating special occasion dresses for the holiday season, while simultaneously preparing for her first journey to Cheyenne in January to establish the second shop. "You should come with me," she told Ethan as they decorated a small pine tree he had cut from his property. "See the territorial capital while we finalize the business arrangements." He hesitated, hanging a carved wooden star on a branch. "I haven't been to a city since before the war." "All the more reason," Rebecca encouraged. "Besides, I hear they have an excellent bookshop. Your collection could use expanding beyond that poor, well-worn Dickens." The prospect of books proved persuasive, and Ethan agreed to the journey with cautious enthusiasm. Their plans for Christmas itself were simple: a special dinner at the homestead, exchanging modest gifts, perhaps attending the Christmas Eve service at Granite Creek's small church if weather permitted. What Rebecca didn't anticipate was Ethan's unexpected disappearance 3 days before Christmas, with only a cryptic note explaining he had business in Cheyenne. That couldn't wait. She tried to dismiss her unease. He was a grown man, after all, perfectly capable of traveling independently, but Charles's betrayal had left scars that occasionally throbbed when least expected. "Stop borrowing trouble," Mrs. Landry advised when Rebecca confided her concerns. "Man's entitled to his mysteries, especially near Christmas. Probably fetching your gift." This logical explanation eased Rebecca's mind somewhat, though she remained distracted as she completed her holiday preparations. When Ethan returned late on December 23rd, his manner was oddly formal, his explanation about banking matters deliberately vague in a way that rekindled her anxieties. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the temperature rising just enough by afternoon to make their planned attendance at the church service feasible. Rebecca wore her finest creation, a deep green velvet dress with ivory lace at collar and cuffs, while Ethan surprised her with a new suit that fit his tall frame remarkably well. "You've been keeping secrets," she teased, adjusting his tie. "This wasn't purchased off the rack in Granite Creek." "Cheyenne has tailors," he admitted with a slight smile. "Seemed appropriate for the occasion." The small church was filled to capacity when they arrived, fragrant with pine boughs and glowing with candlelight. Rebecca noticed several approving glances as they took their seats, the community's acceptance of their relationship now seemingly complete. Even Mrs. Hargrove nodded cordially from across the aisle, her previous disapproval evidently set aside for the holiday spirit. The service itself was simple but moving, familiar carols sung with heartfelt sincerity, readings from Scripture that spoke of hope and new beginnings, a brief sermon on the transformative power of love. Throughout, Ethan held Rebecca's hand, his thumb occasionally brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that had become precious for its unconscious tenderness. As the final hymn concluded and congregants began exchanging Christmas greetings, Ethan surprised Rebecca by leading her not toward the exit but to the front of the church, where Reverend Thompson stood conversing with Sheriff Miller. "Reverend," Ethan addressed the minister with uncharacteristic formality, "if you have a moment before departing, I'd like to ask a favor." Reverend Thompson, a kindly man in his 60s with snow-white hair and perpetually smiling eyes, regarded them curiously. "Of course, Ethan. How can I help?" "I was hoping," Ethan paused, suddenly seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "That is, we were hoping you might perform a small ceremony, now if possible." Rebecca's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Ethan," he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not one for grand gestures or eloquent speeches," he said, his voice low and intent. "But I know what I want, Rebecca, what I need. It's you today, tomorrow, for whatever years were granted. A wedding. Now," she whispered, joy and astonishment rendering her nearly speechless. "Unless you'd prefer to wait," he amended quickly. "I should have asked properly with time for you to consider." "No," Rebecca interrupted, squeezing his hands tightly. "Now is perfect, absolutely perfect." Reverend Thompson beamed at their exchange. "Well then, it seems we have one more Christmas blessing to bestow. Sheriff, would you and Mrs. Miller stand as witnesses?" Word spread rapidly through the remaining congregants, and what had been intended as a simple ceremony quickly became a community celebration. Mrs. Landry hurriedly arranged flowers from the altar decorations into a makeshift bouquet for Rebecca, while Mr. Simmons produced a pair of simple gold bands from his waistcoat pocket, with a wink that suggested Ethan's banking business in Cheyenne had included additional errands. In the warm glow of Christmas candles, with winter stars visible through the church's small windows, Rebecca and Ethan exchanged vows that formalized what their hearts had already decided weeks before. The words were traditional, but the meaning they invested in each promise transformed the familiar phrases into deeply personal covenants. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson declared, his voice carrying to the farthest corner of the small church. "What God has joined together, let no one separate." Ethan's kiss was gentle but unmistakably possessive, a public declaration of commitment that brought spontaneous applause from their impromptu wedding guests. As they turned to face the congregation, Rebecca was struck by the genuine happiness reflected in the faces surrounding them, a community that had once rejected her now celebrating her joy as if it were their own. Later, as they rode toward the homestead through moonlit snow, Rebecca marveled at the unexpected turn her life had taken since that fateful day when an entire town had stood against her. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. Ethan glanced over, his expression questioning. "For what specifically? For believing in me when you had no reason to, for offering protection without conditions, for seeing something in me worth defending before you knew me at all." He considered this thoughtfully before responding. "Perhaps I recognized something familiar, someone else who carried wounds but refused to be defined by them." They crested the final rise before the homestead, the cabin visible below with smoke curling invitingly from the chimney, Jimmy Fletcher having prepared it for their return as a wedding gift. "Home," Rebecca said softly, the word carrying new weight and meaning. Ethan reached across the space between their horses, his gloved hand finding hers. "Home," he agreed, "for both of us now." Spring arrived with characteristic Wyoming caprice, warm sunny days alternating with sudden snowstorms well into April. The seasonal transition brought changes to the Pierce homestead, both physical and metaphorical, as Ethan and Rebecca settled into married life with surprising ease. The cabin expansion continued steadily, with a proper bedroom added opposite Rebecca's sewing room, and the original living space renovated to better accommodate two people rather than one. The garden plot doubled in size, with ambitious plans for vegetables and herbs that would support Rebecca's newly discovered interest in cooking. "You've domesticated the most confirmed bachelor in Wyoming Territory," Sheriff Miller observed during a rare social visit in late April. "Never thought I'd see the day," Pierce fretted over the proper placement of curtains. "I was not fretting," Ethan protested from across the newly enlarged dining table, "merely noting that west-facing windows require sturdier fabric to withstand the afternoon sun." Rebecca and Mrs. Miller exchanged amused glances at this evidence of transformation, though Rebecca was careful not to embarrass her husband further. The truth was, Ethan's adaptation to shared living had been remarkable, his natural reserve gradually giving way to unexpected warmth and even occasional playfulness within the privacy of their home. Their professional arrangements had stabilized as well. The Cheyenne shop opened successfully in February, with Mrs. Simmons's cousin proving an excellent manager. Rebecca's designs were gaining regional recognition, with orders occasionally arriving from as far away as Denver. Her travels to Cheyenne became monthly affairs, sometimes accompanied by Ethan, who had discovered a surprising taste for city amenities, particularly bookshops when experienced in small doses. The Granite Creek shop maintained reduced hours, open 3 days weekly, with Rebecca creating most garments at the homestead sewing room. This compromise allowed her to balance business responsibilities with ranch duties that increasingly engaged her interest. She had discovered an unexpected affinity for the vegetable garden and, more surprisingly, for working with the small herd of horses Ethan had begun breeding. "You have a natural way with the yearlings," he commented one May afternoon as they worked together in the corral. "They trust you instinctively." Rebecca gently stroked the forehead of a chestnut filly who had initially resisted human contact but now sought her attention. "Perhaps they recognize a kindred spirit, another creature learning to trust again after disappointment." Ethan's expression softened as he watched her. "You've transformed this place, transformed me." "We've transformed each other," she corrected gently. "That's the beauty of what we've found, isn't it? Neither diminished by the connection, both expanded." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jimmy Fletcher, now employed part-time at the homestead while apprenticing with his father's barbering business in town. The young man approached with unusual hesitation, clearly bearing news he was uncertain how to deliver. "Mr. Pierce, Miss Rebecca," he began, twisting his hat in his hands. "Telegram came for you at the station. Station master asked me to bring it out since I was headed this way." Ethan accepted the folded paper with a nod of thanks, his brow furrowing slightly as he read the brief message. His expression remained carefully neutral as he handed it to Rebecca. "It's from Denver," he explained unnecessarily, as she could see the origin clearly marked. The telegram was brief, but consequential. "Reeves' family bankruptcy proceedings concluded. Stop. Your testimony may be required regarding financial dealings. Stop. Please respond soonest regarding availability. Stop. District Attorney Hammond, Denver." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as the implications registered. Charles Reeves and his family, the people whose machinations had driven her from Denver less than a year ago, were facing legal consequences that might require her participation. "You don't have to go," Ethan said quietly when she remained silent. "Whatever happened there is in the past." Rebecca appreciated his protective instinct but shook her head slowly. "If they've truly committed financial crimes, my testimony could help ensure justice. I can't hide from that responsibility simply because it's uncomfortable. Then we'll go together, Ethan decided, his tone brooking no argument. Jimmy can manage things here for a week or two with help from the Miller boys. The journey to Denver the following week proved less daunting than Rebecca had anticipated. Ethan's steady presence beside her providing a buffer against painful memories. The city had changed little in the months since her hasty departure, yet she viewed it with entirely different eyes, no longer a desperate woman seeking security, but someone who had found genuine partnership and purpose. Their meeting with District Attorney Hammond revealed the full extent of the Reeves family's malfeasance years of financial manipulation, fraudulent investments, and misrepresentation that had finally collapsed under scrutiny. Rebecca's testimony regarding Charles's attempt to entrap her in a bigamous marriage represented just one facet of a pattern of deception that had harmed dozens. "Your statement alone won't determine the case," Hammond explained, "but it establishes character and intent in a way that strengthens our overall position." To Rebecca's relief, her court appearance proved brief and straightforward. Charles himself was not present, having apparently fled to Canada when investigations intensified. But his father and brother sat at the defense table, noticeably diminished from the imperious figures she remembered. Neither would meet her eyes as she testified clearly about Charles's deception, and his family's subsequent efforts to silence her through social ostracism. Ethan, sitting directly behind the prosecutor's table, maintained an expression of calm support throughout her testimony, though Rebecca noticed how his jaw tightened when she described the most painful aspects of her experience. When she completed her statement and returned to her seat beside him, his hand found hers immediately, a silent affirmation of his pride in her courage. "You did well," he murmured as they left the courthouse afterward. "Very well indeed." Rebecca exhaled deeply, feeling as if a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged had finally lifted. "It's strange facing them again was less terrifying than I expected. They seemed so diminished." "You're seeing them through new eyes," Ethan observed astutely, "without the power they once held over your future." They spent 3 additional days in Denver, unexpectedly enjoying the city's amenities now that the specter of Rebecca's past no longer loomed so large. They visited bookshops and theaters, dined in restaurants far more elegant than anything Granite Creek offered, and even attended an orchestral concert that left Ethan surprisingly moved. "We should do this occasionally," Rebecca suggested as they prepared for the journey home. "Visit cities, experience different surroundings. It makes returning to our quiet life all the sweeter." Ethan agreed readily, another small evidence of how far he had traveled from the isolated man she had first encountered. "Though perhaps next time we might choose a destination without legal proceedings attached." Their return to the homestead coincided with early summer's full flowering, the landscape transformed by vivid greenery and wildflowers in riotous bloom. Jimmy Fletcher had maintained everything admirably in their absence, with only a few minor mishaps involving an overly curious calf and Mrs. Miller's prize chickens, which had somehow found their way onto Pierce property. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm through June and July days, filled with productive work balanced by evenings of companionable leisure. They occasionally attended social functions in Granite Creek, no longer objects of curiosity, but accepted members of the community. Ethan even agreed to serve on a committee planning improvements to the town's water supply, a level of civic engagement that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. In late August, as the first hints of autumn touched the aspen leaves with gold, Rebecca made a discovery that would transform their lives yet again. Her suspicions, based on familiar symptoms recalled from observing friends in Denver, were confirmed by Dr. Ellis during his monthly circuit through the region's smaller settlements. "Congratulations, Mrs. Pierce," the elderly physician announced after a brief examination. "I'd estimate you're approximately 12 weeks along. The baby should arrive sometime in February." Rebecca had anticipated this news, had even hoped for it, but the reality still left her momentarily speechless. She had never imagined motherhood as part of her future during those difficult years of independence, had consciously set aside such dreams as incompatible with her circumstances. "Is everything proceeding normally?" she managed to ask once she found her voice. "Perfectly normal, doctor," Ellis assured her, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "You're healthy and strong, exactly what we like to see. Just maintain good nutrition, reasonable rest, and avoid overly strenuous activities as your condition advances." Rebecca waited until evening to share the news with Ethan, arranging a special dinner and taking particular care with her appearance. His expression when she finally told him wonder mingled with momentary fear, before resolving into profound joy would remain among her most treasured memories. "A child," he repeated, as if testing the concept for believability. "Our child. Due in February," Rebecca confirmed, watching emotions play across his normally composed features. "Are you pleased?" Ethan reached across the table to take her hand, his eyes suspiciously bright. "More than I have words to express. I never thought after Sarah, after everything, that I would have this chance." "Nor I," Rebecca admitted softly. "There were years I convinced myself I didn't want children, that independence was preferable to vulnerability. I was wrong." "We'll need to prepare," Ethan said, his practical nature asserting itself through emotion. "The cabin will need another room, and perhaps we should consider hiring more permanent help for the ranch work, at least until," Rebecca laughed, squeezing his hand to interrupt the flow of planning. "We have months before the baby arrives, my love, plenty of time for preparations." "Of course," he agreed, visibly making an effort to temper his enthusiasm. "It's just this feels momentous in a way I wasn't prepared for. For both of us," she assured him. Word of the impending addition to the Pierce family spread quickly through Granite Creek, met with general delight, and an immediate increase in unsolicited advice from every mother and grandmother in the vicinity. Rebecca accepted these well-meaning intrusions with good grace, recognizing them as the community's way of embracing their expanding family. Preparations for the baby occupied much of autumn, with Ethan applying his considerable carpentry skills to creating not only a nursery addition, but also beautifully crafted furniture, a cradle that could rock gently, a chest of drawers with carefully smoothed edges, a rocking chair for Rebecca that he claimed had required 3 attempts to perfect. "You've become quite the craftsman," she observed one November afternoon, running her hand appreciatively over the polished surface of the cradle. "These pieces will become heirlooms." "I want everything perfect," Ethan admitted, slightly embarrassed by his own perfectionism. "Our child deserves the best we can provide." "Our child already has what matters most," Rebecca countered, taking his hand and placing it on her now prominent belly, where the baby's movements had become increasingly vigorous. "Love, security. Parents who chose each other deliberately and will choose this child every day." As winter descended in earnest, Rebecca's activities necessarily became more limited. The Cheyenne shop continued under her distant supervision, with occasional visits from the manager rather than Rebecca making the journey. The Granite Creek location closed temporarily, with promises to reopen in spring with a new line of children's clothing that Rebecca was designing during her confinement. Christmas, That year, their first anniversary was celebrated quietly but with deep contentment. The expanded cabin, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, felt truly like the heart of a home now, filled with evidence of their shared life and anticipation of the future. They exchanged modest books for Ethan, a silver hand mirror for Rebecca, but their real focus remained on the greater gift expected in the coming weeks. January brought heavy snowfall that temporarily isolated the homestead. Though Ethan had prepared thoroughly with ample supplies and arrangements for Dr. Ellis to stay in Granite Creek throughout the month, ready to travel to the ranch when Rebecca's time came. Sheriff Miller and his sons kept the road cleared as best they could, making weekly visits to ensure all remained well. Rebecca's labor began in the pre-dawn hours of February 10th, earlier than expected but not alarmingly so. Ethan, who had been sleeping lightly for weeks in anticipation, immediately sent Jimmy Fletcher, now residing in the barn loft as full-time help, to fetch the doctor while he attended to Rebecca with surprising composure. "Remember what Mrs. Miller taught us," he encouraged, helping her walk slowly around the cabin as she had been instructed. "Steady breathing through the pains." Rebecca, despite discomfort that intensified with each hour, found herself touched by Ethan's transformation from the solitary, reserved man she had first encountered to this attentive partner, who had apparently memorized every piece of childbirth advice offered over recent months. Dr. Ellis arrived by mid-morning, bringing Mrs. Landry as an experienced assistant. The labor progressed steadily if slowly, with Rebecca drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Throughout, Ethan remained close, supporting her physically during the worst contractions and offering quiet encouragement when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her during a particularly difficult moment, his voice low and intense. "Stronger than any soldier I served with, braver than anyone has a right to expect." These words, spoken with such conviction, carried Rebecca through the final stages of labor. As afternoon light began to fade into evening, their son entered the world with a robust cry that filled the cabin. 7 pounds of new life with a shock of dark hair and his father's determined chin. "He's perfect," Dr. Ellis announced after a thorough examination. "Strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for." Mrs. Landry efficiently cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing him in Rebecca's eager arms. The sensation of holding her child, this miraculous being who had existed only as movement and imagination hours before, created an expansion in Rebecca's heart that she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing a gentle finger along his cheek. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan sat beside them on the bed, his expression a complex mixture of wonder, pride, and unmistakable love. When Rebecca carefully transferred their son to his arms, tears he made no attempt to hide tracked down his weathered face. "What shall we name him?" Rebecca asked softly, watching the profound connection forming between father and son. Ethan considered the small face solemnly regarding him. "I've been thinking about William after my father, William Thomas Pierce, unless you had something else in mind." "William Thomas," Rebecca repeated, testing the sound. "It suits him perfectly." Later, after Dr. Ellis had departed with promises to return the following day and Mrs. Landry had withdrawn to the spare room to allow the new family privacy, Rebecca and Ethan lay together in their bed, William sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. "I never imagined this," Ethan confessed quietly, his arm cradling Rebecca against his side. "Any of it, you, our son. This feeling of completeness." "Nor did I," Rebecca admitted. After Charles's betrayal, I convinced myself that independence was safer than connection, that building a business would provide all the satisfaction I needed. And now, she smiled, nestling closer despite her lingering soreness. Now, I understand that real safety isn't found in isolation or self-sufficiency. It's found in choosing someone who sees your wounds and loves you not despite them, but including them. Ethan's hand stroked her hair with gentle reverence. When I took you in that day stood against the town's judgment, I thought I was helping you. You were, Rebecca assured him. Perhaps, he acknowledged. But what I didn't realize was how much you would change me, how much you would heal what I thought permanently broken. The quiet confession, offered in darkness to the woman who had transformed his solitude into family, represented how far Ethan Pierce had traveled from the isolated rancher, who had once defined himself by what he had lost, rather than what he might still find. Outside, snow fell softly on the Wyoming landscape, blanketing the homestead in pristine white. Inside, three hearts beat in newfound harmony, a family created not from obligation or convention, but from courage, choice, and the transformative power of love that sees beyond fear to possibility. As spring returned once more to the high country, the Pierce homestead flourished with renewed purpose. William grew rapidly, displaying his father's thoughtful temperament and his mother's determined spirit in equal measure. The cabin, once a bachelor's Spartan refuge, had evolved into a true family home, filled with evidence of their shared life: Rebecca's sewing projects, Ethan's woodworking, and increasingly, William's presence in toys, tiny garments, and the indescribable atmosphere that accompanies a much-loved child. Rebecca's dress shops continued to prosper, though with adjusted arrangements that allowed her to balance business and motherhood. The Granite Creek location reopened with limited hours, while the Cheyenne branch expanded to include a dedicated children's department featuring Rebecca's designs. She traveled less frequently, but found her reputation growing nonetheless, with occasional commissions arriving from as far as Denver and Salt Lake City. Ethan, for his part, had expanded the ranch operations thoughtfully, adding to their cattle herd and developing the horse breeding program that had begun as a minor interest. With Jimmy Fletcher now employed full-time and additional seasonal help during busy periods, the homestead had become a small but respected operation in the region. More significant than these external changes, however, was the transformation within their community. What had begun as one man's defiance of public opinion, Ethan's decision to stand for Rebecca when the town turned against her, had evolved into something neither could have anticipated: a kind of informal sanctuary for others facing similar judgment. It began with Martha Collins, a young widow whose husband's gambling debts left her destitute and unfairly blamed by creditors. Rebecca offered her employment in the dress shop, while Ethan spoke forcefully at a town meeting about the distinction between Daniel Collins's failings and his widow's character. The community, perhaps recalling their earlier misjudgment of Rebecca, responded with unexpected support. Then came the Jensen family, immigrants from Denmark, who faced suspicion due to language barriers and unfamiliar customs. Ethan, discovering that Mr. Jensen possessed exceptional skills with horses, hired him for the spring breaking season, while Rebecca arranged English lessons with the schoolteacher. By summer, the Jensens had become valued members of Granite Creek society, their initial isolation forgotten. "You've developed quite a reputation," Sheriff Miller commented during a July visit to the homestead, where he bounced 18-month-old William on his knee with grandfatherly delight. The Pierces, champions of the unfairly judged. "Hardly that," Ethan demurred, though his expression suggested the characterization didn't entirely displease him. We simply recognize that frontier communities sometimes rush to conclusions. As they did with my wife, he added, his gaze finding Rebecca across the room where she sorted through fabric samples with Mrs. Jensen. Sheriff Miller nodded sagely. Sometimes the best lessons come from acknowledging our mistakes. Granite Creek is a better place for having learned that one. As summer faded into autumn, Rebecca discovered that their family would expand once more, another child expected in late spring. The news delighted Ethan, who had taken to fatherhood with unexpected natural skill, and thrilled young William, though his understanding of an impending sibling remained charmingly abstract. "Baby brother," he announced decisively one evening, patting Rebecca's still flat stomach with proprietary confidence. "Or sister," Ethan corrected gently. "We won't know until the baby arrives." William considered this possibility with solemn deliberation before shaking his head. "Brother," he repeated with the absolute certainty only a toddler can muster. Rebecca and Ethan exchanged amused glances over his dark head. "Well, we have months before we'll discover who's right," Rebecca observed diplomatically. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through winter, with Rebecca maintaining better health than during her first experience. The community, now fully invested in the Pierce family's welfare, provided abundant support, Mrs. Landry delivering hearty stews, Mrs. Miller offering to mind William one afternoon weekly to allow Rebecca rest, Mr. Simmons extending credit at the general store with insistence that payment could wait until after the blessed event. April brought not only spring's renewal, but also the anticipated addition to their family. William's confident prediction proved accurate. A second son arrived on a clear morning amid meadowlark songs, his entrance into the world considerably less dramatic than his brother's winter birth. "He has your eyes," Ethan observed, cradling the newborn with practiced ease while Rebecca rested. "And possibly your practical nature. No fuss, straight to business." They named him Samuel James Pierce, Samuel for Rebecca's father, James for Ethan's closest friend lost at Vicksburg. Unlike his brother's intense scrutiny of the world, young Samuel regarded his surroundings with peaceful acceptance, content to observe from the safety of loving arms. William, after initial wariness, appointed himself unofficial guardian of his brother, solemnly explaining household objects to the uncomprehending infant and creating elaborate stories about the ranch animals for Samuel's supposed edification. By summer's height, the Pierce homestead had fully embraced its expanded configuration, a family of 4 supported by a prospering ranch and successful business, surrounded by a community that had evolved from suspicious judgment to genuine acceptance. What had begun as a temporary arrangement of necessity, a solitary rancher sheltering a falsely accused woman, had transformed into something neither could have foreseen, but both now recognized as invaluable. A true home built on chosen connection rather than obligation. 5 years to the day after Ethan had first confronted the crowd outside Sheriff Miller's office, the Pierces hosted a celebration at their ranch, ostensibly marking the expansion of their horse breeding program, but in reality commemorating the journey that had brought them to this point. Granite Creek's residents arrived in wagons and on horseback, bearing food and good wishes in equal measure. As twilight softened the landscape, Ethan found Rebecca sitting alone on the porch steps, watching their sons playing with the Jensen children under Mrs. Miller's watchful eye. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. Rebecca smiled, leaning naturally into his familiar warmth. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have gone if you hadn't happened to ride into town that particular day, at that precise moment." or if you hadn't had the courage to maintain your innocence despite overwhelming opposition, Ethan added. Life turns on such small hinges sometimes. You ever regret it? She asked, not because she doubted, but because the magnitude of what they'd built together sometimes still amazed her. Taking in a woman the town rejected. Finding yourself with the family you never thought possible. Ethan's arm circled her shoulders, drawing her closer as they watched William carefully showing Samuel how to pet a patient ranch dog. Not for a single moment, he answered with absolute certainty. Every choice that led us here was the right one, even when we couldn't see the path ahead clearly. Rebecca rested her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that what had begun as an act of principle, one man's stand against hasty judgment, had blossomed into the greatest blessing of their lives. A family created not from obligation but from courage, choice, and the transformative power of love that sees beyond circumstance to possibility. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the community that had once stood against them but now celebrated their success, Ethan and Rebecca Pierce watched their sons laughing in the last golden light of day, living testament to the family they had built together, one brave choice at a time.